Okay, let's dive into this because honestly, few things on the internet generate quite as much intense, vitriolic debate as the simple word soccer. If you've spent, any time at all around international sports fans, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There is this massive global friction between fans in the United States and fans everywhere else in the world over what to call the absolute most popular game on the planet. But, as we're going to see today, the true story behind this word is essentially a historical mystery. It's got twists, it's got turns, and some incredibly unexpected origins. I mean, just look at this. There is no sport called soccer. It's football. This angry internet comment, which was actually featured in the research of Professor Stefan Szymanski from the University of Michigan, perfectly captures the modern cultural friction we were talking about in this explainer. We've all seen comments exactly like this one, usually typed in all caps across comment sections everywhere, sometimes accompanied by a ton of foul language and genuine, real anger. The rest of the world absolutely insists that Americans are stubbornly, ignorantly using the wrong word. But what if the Americans actually aren't wrong? What if the rest of the world is, in fact, missing a massive piece of their own history? We're going on a bit of a detective journey today, because the ultimate plot twist in this global debate is that the British actually invented the word soccer. It is entirely 100% a British creation. So you might be wondering, how did a word created in England become so passionately hated by the English and yet adopted so enthusiastically by the Americans? Well, let's find out. That brings us to Section 1, the British origins of soccer.
So, to set the scene, back in 19th century England, football games were incredibly chaotic. They were totally unstandardized. You could travel from one village to the next or from one school to the next and find a completely different version of the game. It was a messy free-for-all, and it desperately needed some kind of organization. Well, order finally arrived in 1863 when a group met at the Freemasons Tavern in London to, bring order to the chaos. They codified the modern rules and established what they called the Football Association. Now, this was a monumental moment because it permanently split the game of football into different codes. Meanwhile, over in the United States, by the 1870s, the term American football was actually already being recorded for their own gridiron sport. So back in England, they realized they had to come up with a specific name to differentiate their newly codified game from all the other wild versions of football being played, and they brilliantly decided to call it association football.
But during those 1863 meetings, a really fascinating split happened. On one side, you had association football, which strictly focused on using the feet. On the other side, you had what would become rugby football. And humorously enough, a club called Blackheath actually walked right out of the original Football Association meetings. Why? Because they stubbornly wanted to keep a rule that allowed them to literally kick their opponents in the shins. No joke. The association, very sensibly, banned shin kicking, so the Blackheath boys left and eventually helped form rugby, where you could use your hands and, originally at least, keep right on kicking shins. Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, the Oxford slang era. So with the sports now officially separated into rugby football and association football, upper-middle-class students at elite universities, places like Oxford, developed this quirky linguistic trend that ended up shaping sports history forever. They absolutely loved shortening words and adding an to the end. For example, they called breakfast brekker. They called rugby rugger. So what do you think they did with association football? Let's move to and see how this builds, because it's pretty satisfying. First, they shortened association to ASOC. Then they added that suffix, creating soccer. And finally, they just dropped the A entirely, leaving us with step 3, soccer. Yep, it was literally just informal campus slang that caught on to help people easily clarify which game they meant in casual conversation. In fact, the invention of the word is usually credited to this guy named Charles Redford Brown, and he was a very patrician or aristocratic figure. He was an Oxford student, he captained the England national amateur team in the 1890s, and amazingly, he was actually known to play with deep pockets in his shorts completely filled with gold sovereigns. He would literally press a gold coin into the hand of his professional teammates every single time they scored a goal. I mean, he represents the incredibly wealthy, elite origins of the word soccer, which is a pretty fascinating contrast to the very working class associations the sport holds in Britain today. Let's move on to Section 3, when Britain loved soccer. Right, so there's this massive modern misconception that Britain never used the word soccer, and that it was solely an American invention from day one. That is entirely, absolutely false. Look at this. In 1970, the legendary Manchester United manager Sir Matt Busby, who is absolute football royalty in the UK, a man who survived the tragic Munich air disaster and went on to win the European Championship, he published his autobiography. And what was the title? My Life in Soccer. Not football, soccer. It was a perfectly acceptable, widely used term over there, especially in books aimed at youth coaching and memoirs. And this brilliantly illustrates the point. Corpus linguistics data compiled by Professor Szymanski is basically the smoking gun here. Look at the frequency of the word soccer in the Times of London. Before World War II, it was barely used at all, but by 1950, it had climbed to 2%. By 1970, it had peaked at around 10% of all references to the sport. The British were happily, willingly using the word soccer interchangeably with football. But then, look at that chart. You see that massive drop-off? By 2010, usage had plummeted all the way back down to 1%. It essentially became an exiled word in British English. So why did it suddenly crash?
That brings us to our final act, Section 4, the anti-American backlash.
So why exactly did the British completely abandon a word they themselves had invented and used happily for decades? Well, the picture becomes crystal clear in the 1970s. Right when the word hit its absolute peak in the UK, the North American Soccer League, the NSL, began bringing these massive global stars like Pelé, Franz Beckenbauer, and George Best over to the United States. Americans were suddenly paying real attention to the sport, and they were, quite naturally, calling it soccer. As the US usage really grew in the 1980s, the UK usage inexplicably began to drop. And the final nail in the coffin? That was 1994, when the US hosted the World Cup. After that, the UK practically abandoned the word entirely. As Professor Szymanski notes in this quote, and this is key, it's really hard to find any logical explanation for the decline of the word in Britain other than its rising popularity in the United States. It's just a fascinating sociological twist. The British rejection of the word soccer was essentially a reaction against American cultural hegemony. Because American culture is just so dominant globally, in movies, music, business, the British used the name of their beloved national sport as a way to push back. They ended up completely abandoning their own linguistic invention simply because Americans started using it. So the crucial point is that Americans really aren't being stubborn or ignorant here. Up until 1974, the governing body of the sport in America was actually called the United States Soccer Football Association. But in that exact year, they officially dropped the word football. And actually, scratch that, they didn't just drop it, they had to drop it. America already had a massively popular sport called American football, which, remember, had been around since the 1870s. The Americans simply kept the word soccer out of pure necessity to distinguish it from the gridiron. So irony of ironies, they kept the old Oxford slang alive while its own creators threw it away. Which really leaves us with this final provocative thought. If language is just a proxy for culture, what other words are we fighting over? The whole soccer versus football debate isn't about some silly American mistake. It's a fascinating linguistic casualty of globalization and cultural pride. It shows us exactly how fiercely we protect our identities through the words we use, and honestly, how quickly we can rewrite our own history just to prove a point. So next time someone gets super angry at you in the comment section about the word soccer, just remember Charles Warford Brown and his pockets full of gold sovereigns. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the assumptions behind the words we use every single day.